When two cave divers decide to document their dive by filming their path through tight tunnels in Tulum, Mexico, they have no idea that the success of their leisurely exploration will hinge on a single decision. This is the fatal breakdown of the Actun cave diving accident. Hans and Stefan were extremely excited about their planned dive for the day. They were in Tulum, Mexico, traveling all the way from Germany to explore this cave. Both men had plenty of experience cave diving as fully certified cave divers. Hans had more than 150 dives, and Stefan had more than 50 cave dives. Each were extremely confident in their abilities and experience. Stefan had only been to Mexico once before to cave dive, but Hans had been in these caves several times before. At 47 and 37 years old, they were fit and healthy, ready for whatever came their way. Their plan was to explore the Cenote Calimba. A cenote is an open pond that is formed where an underwater tunnel has collapsed. This creates a pool which leads to a water-filled tunnel underground. This particular system of tunnels, the Sistema Actun, is one of the largest in the world. The maze of pathways, tunnels, and tight squeezes are an exciting draw for cave divers. The pathway from Cenote Calimba leads to several other cenotes along the way. The water current flows from Calimba towards Gran Cenote. It makes for an easy path out with the water at your back, pushing you along comfortably. Hans and Stefan were planning to use the push from Calimba to go out and explore Mooch's maze, all while videoing the entire dive. They were both equipped with 2 side-mount tanks and planned to leave staging bottles after the first 30 minutes of the dive. Staging bottles are extra tanks of air that are placed along the diving path as backup gas sources in case they are running low on air. The guys intended to return back to Calimba for their exit. It was a bold choice, because the second half of the dive would include swimming against the current and squeezing through tight restrictions that led back to Cenote Calimba. Several other teams of divers would be heading out that day as well, with all starts staggered by an hour. Hans and Stefan entered the cenote at 10:30 a.m. on Wednesday, November 14, 2018. The plan for the day was set, and they were excited about the dive ahead. The first portion of the dive is filled with narrow passages and tight squeezes. They had their side-mount tanks, so there was more flexibility to where they would actually fit. The boa restriction takes slow and precise movement through the rocky passage, where some parts are just 18 inches wide. Each man turned his way through the maze, pulling and pushing where necessary, always waiting for their dive partner to make it through. They each took turns manning the camera to document the adventure, while the other was winding through tunnels. After the first 28 minutes of diving, they decided to drop their staging tanks. They thought they were through a good distance of the entrance of Calimba, and had used half the air in the stage bottles. What they didn't know was that they were barely through the first section of Calimba. The videography had severely slowed their progress, and they had dropped the tanks at a spot that they normally would have passed after just 15 minutes of diving. They continued on through the rest of the permanent Calimba line. In the Actun system, there are several permanent lines leading from each of the cenotes. If you want to move from one permanent line to the other, you'll need to install your own jump line. This not only links your path between lines, but lets other divers know that someone is down the path ahead. Hans and Stefan placed their jump lines, along with cookies to show both identity and direction. Cookies are small plastic clips that divers use to mark lines for direction. Each diver places his own cookies, so that he is sure of the direction while deep inside a water-filled tunnel. These are essential markers for each person to be confident in their own navigations, no matter what other divers are doing. Although Hans was the more experienced diver, both he and Stefan were experienced enough to know what dangers may lay ahead. Unfortunately, even the most experienced divers can't survive without air. After jumping onto the Mooch's maze line, the guys enjoyed exploring the area and moved through while videoing each step of their adventure. After Mooch's maze, they would have to set another jump line to move over to the Paso de Lagarto main line. They were now 75 minutes into their dive, and according to their dive computers, had decided to turn around to start heading back. This moment may have been the critical point in their dive. When they turned back, they had probably noticed an unusual depletion of air in their tanks. It had seemed like an easy trip out to this point with the current, but they had been distracted with their videotaping and didn't realize that they had passed the rule of thirds. Under normal diving circumstances, divers would use 1/3 of their air on the trip out, 1/3 on the trip back, and keep 1/3 in reserve for emergencies. After having passed the 1/3 point, they quickly turned and headed back the way they came. They pulled up the jump line that was placed between Paso del Lagarto and Muchas Maze. The video record continues until 93 minutes, and things seem to be going along just fine. They were a little behind schedule, but the video shows a comfortable pace within Muchas Maze. 7 minutes later, they were pulling the jump between Muchas Maze and the main Calimba line, on their way to the tight restrictions of the snaking Calimba pathway. It was just after this time that they faced a scary moment in their dive. They were running low on air and had to make a decision. Either to continue swimming against the current of water, through a slow and tight maze of tunnels, or swim along with the flow in large open pathways toward the Gran Cenote exit. Stefan wrote a question on his wet notes. "Gran Cenote, okay?" Hans scribbled, "No matter where, out." The dwindling supply of air was starting to become frightening. They needed to pick a path and get going toward an exit point. Even though they were moderately close to their bailout tanks, the path to get there would take too much time in their estimation. They decided to take the longer, but hopefully faster route out to Gran Cenote. It was 106 minutes into their dive when they re-entered Muchas Maze and quickly moved to the Paso de Lagarto main line. It seems that they did this rather efficiently, and the men started down the main line heading to the closest exit. Along the walls of the cave, large arrow markers were drawn showing the direction of the closest exit. They could see these as they went along, knowing that they were heading in the right direction. Stefan could see that his tanks were almost empty, and he was frantic. Hans deployed his extra regulator hose so Stefan could share one of his 2 tanks. They were steadily moving along, trying not to panic, but their heart rates were rising. When they checked the tank pressure, they were each flooded with dread. They quickened the pace, which ultimately used the air much faster than planned. As they neared the end of the Paso de Lagarto line, they began straining to pull air from the shared tank. It was empty. The wide-eyed moment of realization sent Stefan into a frantic swim for the exit. Hans was stunned. His tanks were empty, and he watched as Stefan swam away using the last bit of air in his own tank. They were at the turn towards the Hotul Cenote exit, which was only a few hundred feet away. This was it, their life-or-death moment. The other teams had returned to the surface and didn't see Hans and Stefan at the Calimba Cenote. Some of the next group went over to Gran Cenote to see if they had exited there. Clearly, something had gone wrong with their dive plan. After notifying the dive shop, they grabbed some new tanks and started back down the Calimba line to see where they might have turned off. Their line markers were there at the T-junction, marking the direction they had gone. As they came down the Paso de Lagarto line, a flashlight was seen on the floor of the tunnel, and just after, laying on the line in the middle of the passage, was the body of Hans. His mask and helmet had been removed, and his tanks were empty. The divers marked this location and continued on to see what had happened to Stefan. After checking several paths, they turned towards the Hotul Cenote, which was the nearest exit. They followed the short path and could see the light of the cenote shining through the water. And there, they found the body of Stefan, just 60 feet from the surface of the water. Both of his tanks were completely empty. Despite their years of experience and certifications, Hans and Stefan found themselves in the middle of a long tunnel, with not enough air between them. Somehow their leisurely swim through the path with the current at their back used far more than the planned third of air. Once they had passed the halfway point in their air supply, the die was cast. No matter which direction they chose, there was just not enough air for them both to make it out alive. Stefan likely had a small reserve of air that allowed him to push forward to the Hotul exit, where he could see the light from above, but just could not make it to the surface. Their deaths were investigated using the video, body locations, dive computers, condition of the equipment, and their wet notes to piece together exactly what happened. Gas mismanagement was ultimately determined to be the cause. They should have planned the turn earlier, knowing that they would have to swim against the current with less energy reserves. When trapped in the unforgiving nature of diving in cave tunnels, a single mistake can cost your life.